also wanted to ask you then about some of the other economic fragmentation risks we see in the region. Saudi Arabia's economy minister also speaking to me last week, he says he's pretty serious about this January 1 deadline for companies to relocate their headquarters to Riyadh. What do you think that means for Dubai, and how can the economy mitigate the impact?
I don't think it's an issue of either or as much as it's an issue of together. I think what's happening is you have a massive interest in the region right now. And whenever I meet with officials, I tell them, always make a difference between what is residence capital and what is tourist capital. Because what typically happens is that if you are doing well in a world that is struggling, then not only will capital be pulled to you because of who you are, but capital will be pushed to you because of what's happening elsewhere. And that capital that is pushed to you tends to turn around quite quickly. So whenever you're making policy, it's important not just to celebrate the incoming foreign direct investment, the incoming capital inflows. It's also important to keep in mind what is resident capital and what is tourist capital. The world is full of stories, especially in Latin America, where authorities didn't make that distinction. And then when the capital turned around, the result was financial domestic instability. And that's the one thing to really avoid.
There's a lot more interest in this part of the world now globally, and particular interest in tapping into the deep pools of public and private capital here. How would you assess the competition for capital on the ground right now?
Huge, absolutely huge. And this takes us to the way the world has changed. And if you remember one thing from this discussion, it's the following. The world has fundamentally changed in two ways. One is liquidity, and two is demand versus supply. Liquidity, I don't need to tell you, has turned around not only in terms of the cost of capital, but the availability of capital. So both quantity and price have changed, and have changed in a way that's going to last for a while. Gone are the days of repressed interest rates. Gone are the days of central banks reliably injecting liquidity. This is both turned around, and it's going to be like this for a while. And part of the reason why that's the case is because the characterization of the global economy has changed. Coming out of the global financial crisis, it was about insufficient demand. There simply wasn't enough demand in the system. And that's what happens when you have a balance sheet recession. So the response to that is flood the system with money. And as long as there isn't enough demand, you don't get inflation. Today, the problem is not insufficient demand. The problem is insufficient supply. It's inflexible supply. There are four drivers of that inflexible supply. They go beyond the pandemic, and they're not going away anytime soon, which means that it's an inflation-prone economy, and it's one that has to be managed really differently. So we are in a different world, both in terms of liquidity, but most importantly, in terms of the balance between global supply and global demand.
Okay, absolutely fascinating. And you will also have an opportunity to ask Mohamed a question very shortly. I think we have about 30 minutes on stage together, so maybe we can spend the next 15 minutes just talking, and then I'll open up to questions. If you have a question in the interim, please just raise your hand. We'll get a microphone over to you, and you can throw some questions at Mohamed as well. Mohamed, also, your latest book is called Perma-Crisis, A Plan to Fix a Fractured World. What is a perma-crisis?
A perma-crisis is the sense that we get hit by one crisis after another. The G20 called it recently Cascading Crisis. You come out of one, and before you can take a deep breath, and critically, before you can restore human, institutional, and financial resilience, you find yourself dealing with another crisis. And that's been our history, that we seem to be going from crisis to crisis. And the book is an attempt to understand why, and most importantly, what to do about it. It ended up, I should say, Dan, it started out as 3 people coming together during the first lockdown, once a week to have a chat. And most people chat about what films they've seen. We were chatting about the global economy. And it was deeply, deeply depressing the first year, deeply depressing. We are talking about the sudden stop to the global economy. We are talking about the failure to recognize that the global economy is not like a light switch that you turn off and then turn back on and all the lights come on. That when you reopen the global economy, things are in the wrong place. Not everything starts together, and people weren't talking enough about that. We were worrying about supply chains. We were worrying about the distribution of vaccines. We were worrying about inflation. And it was deeply depressing, I'll tell you, these calls. And then we stumbled on a very simple way to explain why these repeated failures were happening, which immediately opens up the question, how can you address it? And the good news is that we have the means to interrupt these cascading crises on the economic and financial front. And that is really good news. It just needs political leadership, and it needs political institutions to respond.
And so that's what's lacking when it comes to fixing some of these issues, would you say?
Yes, and we've had 3 major failures. One is the failure to grow in a durable fashion, in an inclusive fashion, and in a fashion that respects the planet. 2 is repeated policy mistakes. And then 3 is the lack of global collaboration at a time when a lot of the issues we face require common action. These 3 things explain the bulk, not everyone, but the bulk of the crises we've had. So you can reverse engineer the solution to these 3 things. And if you embark on that mindset, you turn this vicious cycle that we're in into a virtuous one.
So of all of the, I guess, key issues that you can identify here, pandemic, climate, recession, wars, politics, China, Ukraine, Trump, what's the biggest risk?
I mean, the biggest risk is that things that are not connected get connected. That's when something turns systemic. So it's a little bit like having little fires everywhere. You can have little fires burning everywhere, but if the little fires come together, you then have a big fire. And as you know, the dynamics of a big fire are very different than the dynamics of a small fire. Look, we fundamentally lack 3 characteristics. And whether you are a country, a government, a household, you should wake up every morning and ask yourself, how am I doing on these characteristics? The first one is resilience, the ability to fall down and get back up. Something will trip you up in this world, but it's the ability to get back up that's really important. And that speaks to balance sheet, it speaks to human resilience. The second is optionality, the open mindset. There have been a whole series of unthinkables that have happened. And if you don't have a fundamentally open mindset, you're going to miss it. And then the third one is agility, the ability to move quickly. And it's those 3 characteristics of resilience, optionality, and agility that become really important, especially if these little fires have a risk of becoming one big fire.
Let's shift our focus over to what's happening in the US as well, because this is your absolute area of expertise and it impacts all of us around the world. With regards to the current growth outlook, US GDP 4.9% in Q3, surprised to the upside, inflation at 3.7%, unemployment at 3.8%. Are we seeing signals that the US is on track for a soft landing?
You know, I love this debate because then, as you know, in the last 15 months, just 15 months, the consensus reported by CNBC and others, the consensus for the US economy in terms of landing has gone through the following sequence. And remember, you're talking about the largest economy in the world with the most mature institutions. The consensus forecast has gone from soft landing to hard landing to no landing, back to hard landing, to crash landing in March, back to hard landing, back to soft landing, and we're now somewhere between soft and hard landing. That's in the last 15 months. And it tells you that even for the largest economy with the most mature institution, we have no idea. We have no idea. And the reason why we have no idea is because there's so many moving pieces. So what have I felt? I consistently said for most of last year and the beginning of this year, up until September, that there was no reason for the US to fall into recession in 2023. That unless you get another massive policy mistake, the inherent growth of this economy is so strong, so diversified, that this economy will continue to surprise on the upside. I'm not so sure about 2024. I think the risk of recession in 2024 is material. Balance sheets have been run down. The Fed has been forced, because it has been so late in taking interest rates to much higher than they would have otherwise, and keeping there for much longer than they would have otherwise. That means that households are starting to look at 8% mortgages, 26% credit cards. So if you were to bring together the various things that are happening and are going to play out for the rest of 2024, the outlook for the US economy is not as good as it was going into 2023.
So what pushes the US into a possible recession in 2024?
So it could be another policy mistake. And we're living in a very strange world. If you are to step back and ask yourself, how has the Federal Reserve slipped? And the Fed, as you know, is really important because the US is the issuer of the reserve currency. The US does have the biggest financial system where countries outsource the management of their savings to the US. So what happens in the US does not stay in the US by any means. Since 2021, we've had at the Federal Reserve failures of analysis. Inflation is transitory. It wasn't. Failures of forecasts, consistently on the wrong side of forecast. Failures of action, not moving fast enough, even when the Fed recognized inflation wasn't transitory. Failures of communication, failures of supervision, and failures of accountability. 6 policy failures. We cannot afford another policy failure. What is today's risk of a policy failure? The Fed over-tightens. The Fed goes too far. That is a risk. What other risks there are the household sector. The US has been led by the consumer. The consumer's savings rate has come down quite a bit. The cost of capital has gone up quite a bit. So that is why there are more headwinds facing the US economy. And the US economy is the only serious engine of growth. You heard from the minister, you will hear from Stephen Roach. China is no longer the engine of growth that it used to be. Europe, as you've heard from His Excellency the Minister, is in recession. So the US has been the engine of growth for the global economy, and that engine is slowing down.
We're seeing yields at GFC levels, and interest rates are expected to stay higher for longer. How concerned are you by the US national debt position, and will that be a factor that ultimately puts the Fed on pause?
So I think it's fascinating. The dynamics of the marketplace have changed. So I'm going to start with why debt has become so much more important. In 2021, it was a recognition that the Fed was late and that the Fed would embark on the most aggressive hiking cycles in a decade. In 2022, 2023, what has been driving the fixed income markets and yields is the recognition of higher for longer. That this notion that the Fed would start cutting rates at the end of this year, which what the market had priced in, is simply not going to happen. Now, it's about supply of treasuries. This week, for example, the most important event on Wednesday is not what the Fed is going to say. It's almost 100% that the Fed will say, we're not changing interest rates. What's really important is something that normally most people in this room don't even know exists. It's something called the quarterly refunding announcement. When the Treasury comes out and announces how much paper is going to issue, how much debt is going to issue. And this is going to be really important because there is concern about buyers. Who's going to buy all this debt and at what yield level? So the first way the debt issue comes in is through the deficits right now that are running 7 to 8% of GDP and that involve continuous issuance of a security whose buyers have become more nervous. Then stepping back, what about the level of debt? Look, it's not a day one concern because the US economy can afford this higher debt level. The US economy also has the potential over the longer term to deliver the one thing that is the best way to get out of a debt issue, which is economic growth. So I worry less about the level of debt today, but I do worry about the change in the amount of issuance that's happening and how that is going to be absorbed by the marketplace.
We spoke briefly about monetary policy. What about on the government side? Fiscal policy missteps, in your view, what are they?
So this is the good and the bad. The good is the US has understood that if you look at the major changes going on in the global economy, and there are three major changes that are going to impact most of us in this room. One is the climate transition, the energy transition associated with the climate crisis. Two is the generative AI technology transition. And three is the life sciences transition. Those are really fundamental transformations that are going to impact all of us in this room. The US has understood, and Europe is starting to understand, and China understood, that each of these transitions require a component of private-public partnership. That it's important to think, what is the role of government? What is the role of the private sector? And how do you make 1 + 1 = more than 2? And we did during the pandemic. During the pandemic, the public-private partnership that enabled the invention and the bringing to market of the vaccine was amazing, absolutely amazing. And it was the right private-public partnership. Both sides focused on what they do well and didn't get into the way of the other side. So the US has understood this, and that's the good news. The less good news is that the US has responded to this only through subsidies, not taxes. Normally what you need is a set of taxes and subsidies. And because of the US political system, it has only responded through subsidies. That adds to the deficit issue and adds to the concerns that are growing about at what yield level will you clear the market for US Treasuries.
With that, I think we can open it up to the floor for some questions. And if maybe we could get a microphone over to the table at the front here. I see one hand raised for Mohamed. Zach, if you wanted to bring the microphone over here, perhaps that'd be fantastic. Thank you. So please state your name, introduce yourself, and what's your question?
Thank you. I'm Lisandro Brill. I'm coming from South America. I'm a cross-border investor in food security, Latin America, and the GCC countries. You have mentioned, well, first, I'm surprised that you have not mentioned permacrisis as a word. So you are not promoting your book. But having said this, you mentioned three transitions, which are climate, AI, and health. You haven't mentioned food security. And there is something that really is moving migration today, is hunger. How do you see the complementarity of Latin America and this region to solve the food security challenge?
Okay, so let me first share with you a story. because you talked about the title. Perma-crisis was not our choice. Our choice for the book was called Changing the Equation. And then the publisher, and all of you who have been publishing books will know the publisher plays a very important role, said, if you put out a book called Changing the Equation, they'll think it's a mathematics book. And if you hope anybody's going to read it, no one's going to read it. So perma-crisis was the word of the year in 2022. Absolutely food security. But I would go back to you, is to ask you, what's the main constraint to food security? And there are two main constraints: good domestic policy and global economic cooperation. So even when you look at food security and solve it for its underlying reasons, you end up with two of the three issues that we talked about. But I'm really glad that in this AIM summit, there will be a focus on food security, because from an economic, socio-political, political, social, it's absolutely critical.
Especially here in the UAE. Sir, in the front, table over to the left.
Before I hand over to the next
Zach.
question, I'll just ask one quickly, if you don't mind. Mohamed, when you were at the IMF in the mid-90s, policymakers engineered what some refer to as the perfect soft landing, characterized by a preemptive strike. We obviously missed a preemptive strike this time, but what secular differences are there today, particularly around productivity growth and demographics, that might make such circumstances more challenging?
That's a great question, Zach. The 90s was a time when you had two big consensus, a domestic consensus and a global consensus. The global consensus was ever closer globalization, economic and financial. This idea that you bring countries together and you augment both supply and demand. And that's the best soft landing, when both supply and demand expand. And there were good reasons. We're bringing on a lot of cheap labor and a lot of consumers. And that was a major contributor to the soft landing that you talk about, Zach. That was the international consensus. The domestic consensus was centered on the concept of the Washington consensus: macro stability, liberalization, structural reforms. And because you were capturing a lot of efficiency gains and you were maintaining macroeconomic stability, that also was contributing to a soft landing. And we had a prolonged period, as Zach noted, of high growth, low inflation. There is no domestic consensus today. There is no global consensus today. And that just complicates whatever soft landing that an individual country is trying to do. The global system is not de-globalizing as much as changing the way it globalized. So this is no longer about uber-globalization. This is about globalization with fragmentation attached to part of it. And the concept that politicians want, which is actually very difficult to deliver in practice, but you will hear that phrase over and over again: de-risking without decoupling. And that's really hard to do. But the de-risking part is a fragmentation. The without decoupling is you maintain part of globalization. And domestically, economics that used to be in the front seat is somewhere now in the back of the bus. And the front seat is politics and national security. So that's why the world is a very different world than it was back in the 90s.
Another question over on this side.
Thank you, Dan. Rami Kiwan, UAE Minister of Economy. Thanks, Mohamed. I've had the privilege of listening to you on more than once since yesterday for the great insights. My question is, you've been highly critical of central banks, obviously, and the Fed in particular, in the beginning being lost in this base effect narrative, being late to act, etc. But then you now mentioned, and you've been talking about this for a while, that there is a shortage of supply. It's a word where supply is very restrained. So there is so much monetary policy can do in such an environment. So why are we being so critical still? Second, on China, there is the slowdown in China and the de-risking and decoupling with the West. It will come at a cost, in my opinion, which means the 2% target is no longer with us. We're probably going to have to live in a world where we have inflation 3 to 3.5%. How should central banks navigate such a new world, and what are the implications for their credibility?
When you fall behind in policy making, you lose the first best policy option. And that it's critical to remember this because it answers both your questions. So in 2022, when the Fed in particular, and why am I more critical of the Fed than I am of other central banks? Think of the Olympics. Think of when you have in the Olympics, you have this notion of degree of difficulty. Gymnastics, what degree of difficulty is involved. The Fed has had the lowest degree of difficulties of any major central bank. And yet, it's the one that has made most of the mistakes. And the US is systemically important, as we noted earlier. So the minute you got stuck into this notion that inflation was transitory, and transitory is a very dangerous word. When I tell you something is transitory, I'm telling you something is temporary and reversible. It will go away on its own, which means do not change your behavior. I laughed when the CEO of Silicon Valley Bank that failed went in front of Congress and he was asked, how did you miss the basic element of risk management, which is managing your interest rate risk on both assets and liabilities? His response is because I believe the Fed that inflation will be transitory. So the minute you fall into the trap of becoming really confident about something you shouldn't be confident about, and you maintain that stance despite mounting evidence that you're wrong, the minute you fall behind. And when you fall behind, it means inflation will get much higher than it is, regardless of what the supply disruption is. You will have higher inflation. You will have to tighten by more than what you would have had to do before. And you will stay tight for longer than you would have had to otherwise. And that's the reality we're in today. Is 2% the right inflation target? If you were coming to it afresh, I'm willing to bet that we wouldn't say 2% is the right inflation target. And 2% is arbitrary. There's nothing scientific about 2%. It was the Central Bank of New Zealand in the early 90s that picked an arbitrary number as an experiment, as a pilot for inflation targeting. That number was adopted by central banks with completely different characteristics. It's as if I say that the right weight target for everybody in this room is 400 kilos. We would all agree it's very high up, it doesn't matter. 2% didn't matter for a long time. But when 2% becomes binding, you have to think, is it the right inflation target? And I think for the US, the correct inflation target is closer to 3% in a world of inflexible supply than 2%. But do not expect the Federal Reserve, the ECB, or the Bank of England to announce a change in the inflation target. That will not happen. It will not happen because it is very difficult for a central bank to change its inflation target when it has missed its inflation target by so much. What is possible is that 2% got pushed into the future and we run a 3% economy and we see whether this 3% economy is stable in terms of inflation expectations. I think that's a real possibility, and I think we would find out that you can have stable inflationary expectations at a 3% target.
Fascinating. Who's next? Maybe a question over on this side.
Thank you very much. Sa'ib El-Zain from Spinnaker Capital. The question is that you have been critical of the Fed, and rightly so, for a number of years. How do you explain their consistent failures and mistakes? And the second question, being critical of the Fed, you haven't been, in my mind, critical enough of the fiscal policy of the US, which is going forward is the most important, probably, policy anchor for the US Treasury is the dollars. I remember back in the 80s, we had a big issue in the dollar when it probably depreciated by 40 or 50%, which ended by the Graham-Rodman agreement then, and the G7 meetings, which stabilized the situation. So fiscal policy comments on the US fiscal policy and their consistent failures is as well quite important. If you can comment on that, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And the ECB and the Bank of England have looked back and asked themselves why it is we made a similar mistake. And they have identified issues that I'm going to talk about today, now in response to your question. The Fed yet hasn't done that exercise, and that's a really important exercise. If you don't learn from your mistakes, you're likely to repeat them. And I quoted recently Christine Lagarde, the president of the ECB, that said, first of all, we over-relied on our models. We were hostage to our models. As you all know, macro models fail when there is a massive structural change. They don't capture the structural change. So if you rely on a model when the world around you is changing, you will end up getting the wrong forecasts, and you will end up having the wrong analysis, and therefore you will not act accordingly. So that's issue number one, over-reliance on models. Issue number two is mindset. And the behavioral scientists among you will know that if I take someone out of a comfort zone, something they're familiar with, and put them somewhere that they're not familiar with, there's a high probability that in their mind, they will deny their new reality and go back to their old reality. And there are three failures that result from that. One is blind spots. You simply don't realize your world has changed. Two is what's called reframing. You see something uncomfortable, but you reframe it to something comfortable. And three is called active inertia. You realize that things are different. You realize that the system, that you need to do something differently, but there's so much inertia in the system, is you end up doing the same thing. You know, the simple example of active inertia is the example of an American tourist in Paris. Goes up to a French person and asks in English something. The French person shrugs their shoulder, either doesn't understand English or doesn't want to understand English. What do you think the most common response of the American tourist is? Say the same thing in English, but louder. That's active inertia. You realize you have to do something different, but you're limited. So the second explanations are behavioral, that simply the mindsets didn't evolve quickly enough. There wasn't enough cognitive diversity around the table to recognize that the world had changed. And the third explanation is accountability. That the independence of central bank, that's absolutely critical for the well-being of economies, isn't accompanied by enough accountability on that. So these are the explanations that I've done. On fiscal policy, look, I was supportive of the interventions we made around the world when the global economy went to a sudden stop. You needed to make sure that the sudden stop doesn't haunt us for decades. And you do that by protecting people's well-being. It was about lives and livelihoods. And you couldn't destroy livelihoods in saving lives. You also had to do something about livelihoods. I've also been critical that you cannot rely simply on the subsidy side, and that you have to focus and center your support to those who need it more. And you can't have just general support. So did we go too far? Yes. We needed to do a lot of what we did, but did we go too far? Yes, we did.
Any other questions? There's quite a few. Let's see where the microphone can land first.
Just a very quick one. Dan, first of all, great job so far. Mohamed, I want you to please connect all the fires that you have mentioned. And where is the safe haven or safe haven assets for consumers and for institutions, please? Thank you.
So we've had this search for safe havens that we have over-constrained. So the definition of safe haven normally is within the usual asset allocation, within public equities and public bonds. And you've had this situation where people have realized that if you limit yourself to these two, there is no safe haven. When liquidity is going out, both are going to get hit. We forgot that we lived in a la-la land where when liquidity was coming in, you made money on your risk assets and you made money on your risk-free asset. Okay? No one complained at that time that correlations had broken down because we were making money both on the risky stuff and on the risk mitigation stuff. Well, when money goes out, if you limit yourself to these two choices, then you continue to loop around looking for safe assets, and you won't find it. We thought bonds were safe, turns out they're not. We thought tech was safe, turns out it's not. Right? We've gone around and around on that. So you have to expand your horizon. First of all, cash is not trash. How often have I heard cash is trash? How often have I heard cash doesn't belong in an asset allocation? It does. Because cash provides you an element of safety during periods of massive fluidity. It gives you optionality that's really important when the world is changing. And today you get paid for holding cash, so you have to expand it. Then on the other side of the barbell, you have to include alternative assets. There's a reason why Bitcoin caught a bid during the recent bond sell-off. There's lots of assets in the alternative space that provide you with much more risk mitigation than just focus on public bonds and public equities. So if you think that way, you go from what has been an overly bulleted approach, focused only on public equities and public bonds, to a much broader barbelled approach that gives you a much broader allocation. And that, in response to your question, is how you start introducing risk mitigation and most safe haven in a world in which people have been really desperate to find safe havens.
I think we might have time for one more question.
Thank you, Dr. Mohamed. Omar Mahana from ADQ. So just on that, in terms of the private markets, what's your approach towards asset allocation and portfolio construction?
So it will come as no surprise that my approach tends to emphasize the tails much more than the belly of the asset allocation curve. So I still have considerable amount of cash, and I find really interesting opportunities in alternatives because of a few things that are happening here. First, markets are breaking down here. So I'll give you an example. You can now lend to perfectly solid companies in the private credit space that have been excluded from bank lending for no reason due to themselves, but due to what has happened on the banking side, and that offer highly collateralized loan opportunities at very attractive interest rates. There's a whole set of, as litigation finance is getting really interesting, there's a whole set of alternative assets that have emerged. There's parts of the crypto that are really interesting. There's whole parts of alternative assets that have emerged. So I have de-emphasized public bonds and public equities, and I have increased the edges of the distribution. And there will come a time when public bonds and public equities will have a bigger share of my allocation, but I don't think it's for the next few weeks.
Fascinating conversation. Mohamed, unfortunately, we are out of time, so we'll leave it there, but please thank Mohamed El-Erian again for enlightening us and for his contribution. Thank you so much.